I've watched India for years. It's an incredible country. And every single year you'd have a new leader. I mean, some would be in there for a few months. And this was year after year after year. And my friend has been there now for a long time. And he's assured me there will be no oil purchased from Russia. I don't know, maybe that's a breaking story. Can I say that? Would you say? There will be no oil. He's not buying his oil from Russia. It started. You can't do it immediately. It's a little bit of a process. But the process is going to be over with soon. And all we want from President Putin is stop this. Stop killing Ukrainians and stop killing Russians, because he's killing a lot of Russians.
It was a quiet Wednesday morning at the White House. Cameras clicked, reporters murmured, and then, with characteristic confidence, Donald Trump leaned toward the microphone. His words sent ripples through Washington and far beyond. Prime Minister Modi has assured me that India will stop buying oil from Russia, Trump declared. That's a big step. Now we're going to get China to do the same thing. In that single moment, an intricate web of diplomacy, economics, and global power began to tighten. Trump's statement wasn't just about oil. It was about the future of alliances, the reach of sanctions, and the shifting geometry of world influence. For months, Washington had quietly pressed New Delhi to reconsider its deepening energy ties with Moscow. Before the war in Ukraine, India's dependence on Russian oil was minimal, less than 1% of its imports. But since the invasion began, Moscow's heavily discounted crude had flooded into India's ports, reshaping the global energy map. That figure surged to nearly 40%, transforming India into one of Russia's key lifelines amid Western sanctions. Trump's announcement, therefore, struck a complex chord. To some, it sounded like a diplomatic breakthrough, a sign that Washington's influence was finally being felt in South Asia. To others, it raised more questions than answers. Had Modi truly made that promise? And if he had, how would India unwind itself from an oil dependency that had become both an economic advantage and a political risk? The Indian embassy in Washington, when pressed for comment, offered none. Emails went unanswered. In New Delhi, officials kept their silence. But the implications of Trump's words were impossible to ignore. Trump described the transition as a little bit of a process, suggesting that India would not turn off the taps overnight. Yet he insisted that the outcome was inevitable, that the world's largest democracy would soon stand with the West against Moscow's aggression. In his trademark style, he called it a big step, one that would pave the way for persuading Beijing to follow. But behind the podium theatrics, the reality was far more complicated. For India, the calculus of oil was never purely political. It was pragmatic. Russian crude, sold at deep discounts, had helped stabilize India's inflation and keep energy prices affordable for millions. Abandoning it would mean courting economic pain at home. And Trump's own position was layered with contradictions. Even as he praised Modi's supposed pledge, he imposed tariffs on Indian exports to the United States. Punitive measures aimed, he said, at curbing the flow of money to Moscow's war chest. These moves, both conciliatory and confrontational, revealed Trump's familiar pattern, mixing pressure with praise, leverage with diplomacy. At the same time, across Europe, NATO was mobilizing in ways not seen since the Cold War. Mark Rutte, the alliance's new Secretary General, announced an ambitious plan to strengthen Europe's defenses against emerging threats. We are testing integrated systems that will help us detect, track, and neutralize aerial threats, he said. It was a direct response to Russia's increasingly aggressive drone warfare, a campaign that had devastated Ukrainian cities and now occasionally spilled into NATO airspace. Within days, the European Union began debating a drone wall, a vast network of sensors, radars, and countermeasures stretching across the continent's eastern frontier. The goal was clear: to prevent another surprise, another violation, another incursion. And yet, even as Europe braced for defense, it also faced a financial test. The EU's economy commissioner, Valdis Dombrovskis, urged G7 nations to consider unlocking frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's reconstruction. Billions of dollars were sitting immobilized in Western banks, earning interest while Ukraine's infrastructure lay in ruins. The idea was controversial but gathering momentum. Under the proposal, institutions like Euroclear in Belgium would loan funds to Ukraine backed by these frozen assets, with the understanding that Russia would eventually pay reparations. It was a delicate balance, helping Ukraine without crossing the line into outright asset seizure, a move that could fracture international financial norms. Meanwhile, on the ground, the war showed no signs of slowing. Russian drones struck cities across Ukraine's northern and eastern regions. In Nizhyn, one person was injured as residential buildings burned. In Kharkiv, guided bombs knocked out power to tens of thousands. Across the country, emergency blackouts spread as the national grid struggled under relentless attack. Ukraine's resilience, though remarkable, was wearing thin. Officials called for more air defenses, more ammunition, more support. And in response, NATO members pledged billions more through the Pearl Initiative, a collective fund for purchasing U.S. weapons for Kyiv. Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, announced $500 million in new contributions. The Czech Republic, under outgoing Prime Minister Petr Fiala, arranged millions of artillery shells. But even within Europe, political winds were shifting. In Prague, Andrej Babiš, recently victorious at the polls, criticized the arms initiative, questioning its sustainability. His ambiguity mirrored a growing fatigue across parts of Europe, the sense that this war, now grinding into its third year, might outlast even the West's patience. At the same time, legal and diplomatic dramas unfolded elsewhere. In Italy, the country's top court blocked the extradition of a Ukrainian man accused of helping coordinate the Nord Stream pipeline attack, a case tangled in jurisdictional errors and geopolitical tension. It was a small story, but symbolic. Even in Europe's courtrooms, the war's shadow loomed large. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin faced a different kind of isolation. Once, the Kremlin had prided itself on being a key player in Middle Eastern politics, a counterweight to U.S. influence. But that image was fading fast. Earlier this year, Putin had planned a grand Russia-Arab World Summit, a showcase of his enduring clout. Yet, as the date approached, only a handful of leaders confirmed attendance. Most turned their attention elsewhere, to Egypt, where Donald Trump, now reasserting himself as a global dealmaker, had joined President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi for a Gaza peace summit. There, surrounded by Middle Eastern and European leaders, Trump smiled for cameras as participants signed what was hailed as a historic Gaza treaty. Analysts noted that, for all its ceremony, the real symbolism lay in who was absent. Russia was nowhere to be seen. That absence spoke volumes. For nearly a decade, Moscow had worked to cement its Middle Eastern influence, arming Syria, courting Iran, and hosting Palestinian delegations. But its war in Ukraine had drained its resources and credibility. While it once projected power across the region, now it could barely maintain footing at home. Experts like Hannah Nate in Berlin observed that major players in the region don't look to Moscow anymore. Even allies like Iran, long dependent on Russian arms and trade, were quietly recalibrating their strategies as Israeli airstrikes intensified. Meanwhile, Israel itself was drifting closer to Kyiv. President Zelenskyy confirmed that Israel had transferred a Patriot missile system to Ukraine, an unmistakable signal of shifting loyalties. Putin, attempting to downplay his absence, claimed he had postponed his summit so as not to interfere with Trump's peace efforts. He even praised the U.S.-led Gaza initiative, calling it historic if successful. But behind the diplomatic politeness, frustration simmered. Russia's veteran foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, expressed quiet resentment, noting that Moscow would not refuse to take part in peace efforts if invited. And Dmitry Medvedev, the outspoken former president, was less restrained. He dismissed Trump's Gaza deal as meaningless. Until a full-fledged Palestinian state is established, Medvedev warned, nothing will change. The war will continue. His words carried the bitterness of a sideline power. Across Central Asia and the Caucasus, the story was much the same. Nations once tethered to Moscow, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, were edging toward the West, wary of Russia's aggression and instability. In August, Trump had hosted Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders at the White House, brokering a peace deal that granted Washington influence over a new trade corridor cutting through the region. It was, in effect, a new geopolitical map, one that placed the U.S., not Russia, at the center of Eurasian diplomacy. Putin still sought symbolic victories. The postponed Russia-Arab summit was rescheduled for November, intended to remind the world that Moscow remained relevant. But few believed it would restore Russia's lost stature. As one analyst put it, it matters symbolically, but it doesn't make Russia a major player again. For Trump, the timing was fortuitous. His administration was reshaping the global stage, pressing allies to align economically and militarily against Moscow, while casting him as the architect of new peace deals. Yet critics argued that his approach, marked by transactional diplomacy and tariff threats, risked alienating allies as much as it constrained adversaries. India's case, in particular, highlighted that tension. In New Delhi, Modi's government continued to balance carefully between Washington and Moscow. While Trump's declaration of India's commitment sounded decisive, the reality was murkier. Indian refineries continued to process Russian crude. Payments, routed through alternate banking systems, flowed quietly despite Western scrutiny. For India, energy security came first, and even Trump's tariffs weren't enough to change that overnight. Still, Washington viewed progress, however slow, as success. If India's imports from Russia began to decline, even marginally, it would signal that Moscow's leverage was weakening further. At the same time, Ukraine's energy infrastructure faced relentless assaults. Russia's missiles and drones targeted not only power plants but gas facilities, striking at the heart of the nation's economy. Ukraine's grid operator, Ukrenergo, described emergency blackouts across all regions, a chilling echo of the winter blackouts that had once plunged cities into darkness. And yet, amid the hardship, Ukraine's leadership pressed forward. Zelenskyy announced new talks in Washington, meetings with Trump, defense contractors, and Congress members. Among the topics, the potential supply of Tomahawk missiles, the protection of Ukraine's power network, and the creation of a special tribunal to prosecute Putin for crimes of aggression. European leaders like Estonia's Kaja Kallas supported the tribunal, calling it essential for a just and lasting peace. In her view, justice and accountability were the only ways to prevent this war, or others, from repeating. But not all the news favored Kyiv. Russia's defense ministry claimed new territorial gains in Donetsk and near Kupiansk. Though these reports could not be independently verified, they underscored the grim reality that, even after years of fighting, the front lines were still shifting, inch by inch, town by town. In Europe, unease was growing. Germany's intelligence chief, Martin Jaeger, issued a stark warning: Russia's ambitions extended far beyond Ukraine. He described an icy peace that could erupt into direct military confrontation. Moscow's methods, he said, were already visible: propaganda, disinformation, espionage, and sabotage. Drone incursions into Poland, violations of Estonian airspace, mysterious cyber attacks. Each incident added to the sense that the Cold War's ghost had returned, updated for the digital age. Through it all, one theme persisted: the reordering of global power. The U.S. and its allies, despite internal divisions, were reasserting leadership. Russia, despite its defiance, was retreating into isolation. And nations like India found themselves navigating the narrow space between economic necessity and geopolitical pressure. When Trump first made his statement about Modi, many dismissed it as another headline-grabbing claim. But as days turned to weeks, the consequences began to crystallize. Washington and New Delhi intensified their energy talks. Europe expanded its sanctions network. NATO fortified its defenses. And the Kremlin, once confident in its alliances, began to look increasingly alone. History often moves quietly, beneath the surface of speeches and headlines. But sometimes a few words, spoken from a podium at the White House, can reveal the deeper shifts already underway. As the war in Ukraine grinds on, and the world's great powers maneuver for influence, one truth remains constant. Energy is power, and whoever controls its flow controls the future. This is exclusive news. Stay informed, stay aware, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share for more global updates.